Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 489 through 491, which will cover manga chapters 580 through 582. And the war has finally come to an end, but what will happen to the physically, emotionally, and mentally scarred Luffy? So, synopsis. Thanks to the bravery of Kobe and the arrival of Shanks and the red-haired pirates, the war has finally come to an end, but the aftermath of the war are immediately felt around the world while Luffy is taken to be treated for his immense wounds at Amazon Lily. Alright, so differences. There are quite a few. So there are a couple added flashbacks to Luffy's flashback when Shanks reminisces about Luffy. This is something we didn't see in the manga. The order of the scenes that play out after the war is over is slightly rearranged, as in the anime it shows the chaos that's taking place around the world. Then the Sengoku and brand new scene happens. Then we get Doflamingo taking out Moria. And then finally we get to see what happens with everything on Law's ship with Luffy and Hancock and everybody. However, in the manga, it starts off the same with the chaos in the world taking place. Then everything that happens with Law and the ship happens next. Then we get the brand new and Sengoku scene, and then it ends with Doflamingo taking out Moria. I mean, I don't really know which one's personally better. I just noticed that it was rearranged, more so probably for flow. I think they wanted it to end more so with Luffy rather than the manga, which wanted to end on the cliffhanger of Doflamingo potentially taking out Moria. Another change that they added was in the anime, they had a couple extra scenes with Beppo and Shachi and Penguin. And yeah, there's a funny scene with Beppo getting really hot inside the submarine. But in the manga, the scene actually begins where they've already met with Hancock and she's already on the deck of the Polar Tang. And then in the manga, of sort of the chaos caused by Whitebeard's death, a town called Food Valten is attacked by some pirates, but we never actually see anything. But in the manga, they do actually show the entire scene with Brownbeard attacking the town. Now, this was actually teased in one of the episodes, and then literally the very next episode, we finally get to see this exact scene play out. I think this was more due to time constraints, that they didn't have enough time to add the whole raid by Brownbeard. And so what they did was they teased it here and then went back and showed it later in another episode. But in the manga, this all happens in one continuity. And then finally, the whole scene of them arriving at Amazon Lily is added filler. And in the manga, this is handled in a quick panel with narration and kind of picks up with Hancock in her throne waiting for Luffy to awaken. And then similarly, the scene where Luffy does awaken is extended in the anime a little bit, where we see him wake up in the Polar Tang and bust out in this sort of like horror movie like scene where Luffy is just incredibly like just lost in himself and sort of creepily walking through and then busts out of the top. Whereas in the manga, it pretty much just shows him already on the coast and yelling, "Where's Ace?" And yeah, that scene is just added, which begs the question, why did they feel like they need to add these scenes, but then they didn't have enough time for the Brownbeard scene to not have to do two separate moments dedicated to that scene? It just seems really weird, but whatever. All right, so let's get into my thoughts on the episodes. Picking up from the shocking ending of the last episode with the arrival of Shanks in probably the most significant role we've seen him in since Luffy's flashback, as he stops Akainu's attack like it was nothing to save Kobe. While it was shocking that Shanks is here, it's not completely out of nowhere, as we know that Shanks and Whitebeard had a somewhat cordial relationship despite being rival pirates. But the biggest indicator that Shanks might get involved is that small scene all the way back in episode 434. During the Impel Down arc, if you cast your memory back while Luffy was in level 3, we're alerted by a marine soldier informing Vice Admiral Momonga that Shanks had engaged Kaido in the New World to stop Kaido from coming to Marineford, who was on his way to use this opportunity to take out Whitebeard and his crew. Clearly, Shanks succeeded, but what has always been a mystery is how he accomplished this, seemingly unscathed as well. It's said here in this episode that their encounter happened yesterday, so if two Yonko pirates were actually engaging in a battle, then Shanks, even with all his strength, probably would not look so good after this, but it seemed that his entire crew is fine and no damage can be seen to have been sustained. So this tells us in all likelihood that Shanks has somehow convinced Kaido not to come using his words. And knowing what we know of Kaido now, this is no small feat. But even just with the information we had back then, I think we could deduce that with Shanks intervening, Kaido realized that it would be foolish to engage in a battle with another Yonko crew, and then directly after that sail to Marineford and take on the Marines and Whitebeard at the same time. I think he just basically weighed out the sort of proposition of taking all those people on and being successful at the same time. So that probably dissuaded him. Or maybe Shanks just gave him like a bunch of alcohol and booze and stuff. Who knows? And then we get a fun reunion of Buggy seeing Shanks for presumably the first time since they left Roger's crew. And it is still funny to see someone like Shanks and Buggy talking like they're on equal footing. Like, Buggy is terrified of Whitebeard, but he has no qualms about talking back to Shanks. And honestly, rewatching these episodes, knowing how deep their relationship goes as we learn more about their time as kids on the Roger crew, as well as what happened between them during Roger's execution, I really enjoy seeing them together and acting like this. Buggy, upon being bribed by Shanks, delivers Luffy's straw hat to Law. And even though Luffy's right there, Lucky Roo asks why he doesn't want to at least see Luffy, but he wanted to preserve that promise Luffy made to him all those years ago that the next time they meet, that he'll be a great pirate. And this is probably the closest Luffy has been to Shanks since the very beginning of the manga and episode 4 of the anime. Of course, the treasure map he bribed Buggy with turns out to be a complete lie in order to get him to deliver the hat to Luffy, which is very on brand between them. And back on the Polar Tang, we see that not only is Law a doctor, but in fact most of his crew is filled with doctors and medical personnel as they get ready to operate to save both Luffy and Jinbei's lives. I think it's a little nuts that they would even attempt to perform life-saving surgery while being pursued by both Aokiji and Kizaru. Like, one curious minor change they made was that when Kizaru rises up to fire the Yasakani no Magatama, in the manga we get a quick shot of Beckman going, crap, I guess he still has some fight in him, thinking that Kizaru had more or less surrendered. And I don't know why they left this out of the anime. It's really bizarre. It doesn't take any time really, and it shows that, I guess maybe it shows Beckman being kind of careless, which is kind of maybe out of character. I don't really know. But yeah, the fact that they were trying to perform surgery while being pursued by both of them and trying to outmaneuver them is kind of nuts, to be honest. Then next, I don't really know how to explain it, but this moment where Shanks walks up with his crew to declare that he's come to end the war, but if anyone still wants to continue fighting, they'll have to fight them, is so damn epic. But there's something more to this. Like, this feeling like of extra reverence for this scene with so many huge players in the story all gathered, especially with so many having ties to Shanks, between Buggy and Shanks, Mihawk refusing to fight Shanks due to their somewhat rival/friendship, and of course Blackbeard and Shanks, as we know, they have some sort of history, with Blackbeard being the one to give Shanks his iconic triple scar on his eye, which he even mockingly mentions, but even he knows it would be stupid to engage them right now and decides to retreat. The presence and command that Shanks has is incredible though. It's here you really start to understand the gravity of Shanks' power and influence. Like, up till now, you knew Shanks was a big deal in the story and the world, and I don't know about everyone else, but for me, this is the moment where it cemented the idea that Shanks is a larger-than-life character and one of the most influential and powerful people in the world of One Piece. Like, I knew he was strong, but I didn't realize to what degree, but more so the influence he commands, as we see in the scene following this, where he asks to handle the burial of both Whitebeard and Ace. While there's objection from a few people, including Vice Admiral Doberman, and a few others, Sengoku immediately says that as long as it's him, he doesn't mind. Like, good lord, the fleet admiral of the Marines even has that much a respect for Shanks that he would bend to his request. And the way Sengoku responds, it's clear this isn't out of fear or intimidation, it's just straight up respect. But you have to wonder what Shanks did to earn this level of respect from Sengoku. Either way, this is very interesting, like this new level of perspective in terms of the geopolitics of the One Piece world where a pirate would receive this kind of treatment. Like, overall, this altered my view of who Shanks is as a character and elevated him to an almost like mythical status in the story, as if he wasn't that already. Is sort of like the, one of the end goals for Luffy in the story. Because up till now, he's always been this sort of like he almost had like a comedic tone to him, especially with his like first couple appearances where he in Luffy's flashback, and then with Mihawk's, like visiting him with Luffy's wanted poster. Like he's always very jovial and kind of silly and drunk and hungover. But I think between this scene and it started to happen when he met with Whitebeard to warn him about Ace going after Blackbeard. And then he started to get this sort of aura of like incredible presence to him. Like he's always been this sort of ever-present presence, as he's featured prominently in every opening theme and at the beginning of every volume of the manga. Like the first couple pages are always dedicated to listing out the major main characters with the Straw Hats and any major supporting characters and villains. But Shanks is always there as well, even if he has no mention in that arc or makes no appearance. He's in that sort of the character bio section at the beginning of every volume. And yeah, he's always there. And so Shanks is definitely kind of this important presence here, and we finally kind of get the sense of why. However, even beyond that, Shanks like has entered like this legendary, almost larger than life being in the story. It's gotten to the point that any mention or appearance from Shanks sends the community into a fever pitch and insane anticipation because of just how mysterious and prominent everything he says or does. And that's nothing to say about his presumed strength and power. I mean, we saw this with One Piece Film Red. When that was released, it became one of the highest grossing movies in Japan and became the most successful movie in the One Piece franchise because of how prominently featured Shanks was in the story. With we just glom onto any crumb of information when it comes to Shanks. It's pretty interesting what has happened to Shanks' character over the years. Moving on, through most of the first half of episode 490, we see the reaction of people around the world with the news of the end of the war and the death of Whitebeard, including members of the worst generation. But the two I wanted to highlight is Bonnie's line, because we don't have much of an idea who she's referring to about something being someone's fault and that she's going to go chase them down in the new world, which I will kind of talk about in the spoiler section. Also, that Hawkins has a cat man. Like, there's nothing to that fact other than I noticed it, and now that we have bear people and cat people, that kind of indicates to us that there's some race of furries or animal people somewhere in One Piece. Of course, that gets expanded upon later on the story too. But over the course of the next few episodes, we see the world of One Piece get even larger and see the course of the world has changed forever. Just as Jinbei had feared, once the news of the death of Whitebeard had spread, the islands that were once under his protection are now being attacked once again by pirates. What Whitebeard did had a double-edged sword effect in that he reignited the great age of piracy, which meant that, the continued search for the One Piece, it goes on, and possibly force a change for the better in overall when it came to pirates like the Straw Hats, but it also meant that there would be more malicious and selfish pirates basically reignited to do evil things as well. To add to the world building, but this time on the marine and world government side of things, we get a brief scene with Brand New reporting to Sengoku about the situation at Impel Down, and we learn that the insanely powerful Magellan was in fact beaten, and beaten within an inch of his life, it seems like. This is where it kind of dawns on you just how dangerous Blackbeard is now with his expanded crew. Like, Magellan made quick work of the original 5 Blackbeard crew members, but he didn't stand a chance against the 10 of them put together. And you certainly understand why. At this point, you kind of just feel bad for Magellan. Like, here's a good dude just trying to do his duty to keep the world safe from all these dangerous prisoners and people. And because Luffy, it not only causes him grave life-threatening injuries to the point where he feels enough shame to want to take his own life if he were physically able to. And yeah, you just kind of feel bad for the dude now at this point. I do like that we get to see and confirm that Sengoku is actually one of the good Marines, despite his high ranking, as he shows genuine concern for Magellan, but more importantly, he wants to get the word out immediately that many of the level 6 prisoners have escaped, but Brand New tells him that the world government, and specifically the Gorosei, want to cover this up as to not instill doubt in the world government's authority and reputation, to which Sengoku is incredibly pissed about, and rightfully so. And it reminds me a lot of the scene with Smoker in Arabasta when the truth about Crocodile's capture was hushed up as well. Both of them clearly care more about the safety of the people rather than politics or their reputation. And we will go on to see how Sengoku responds to this rather unsavory attitude the world government takes towards this whole situation. It is kind of depressing though that even someone as high ranking and as powerful as Sengoku is, like, even he is unable to do the right thing because of corrupt leaders and politicians. Very much kind of mirroring our own real world, to be honest. It's a very cynical way of seeing the world, but sadly it's true. I think that's also one of the reasons why One Piece resonates so well with young adults and even older adults these days, is because of its very anti-establishment themes, with this sort of this disillusionment with our own corrupt government and ineffective ones. It's just that in the world of One Piece, they have magical fruits that give them the power to fight back, whereas in the real world, we don't have such things, unfortunately. In another fallout from this war, we get a brief scene of Doflamingo in the process of eliminating Moria, as he's been deemed too weak to maintain the Shichibukai title on the authority of what is implied to be the Gorosei. That now leaves three Shichibukai seats empty, with Blackbeard and Jinbei both resigning and vacating their positions, and Moria being kicked out, leaving all three of the world powers in a state of complete disarray, with Marine headquarters in shambles, half the Shichibukai gone, and one Yonko dead, and the entire balance of the world has been basically thrown into chaos. And I was very interested to see who they were going to replace these three spots with, whether they would be like promotions from other characters we've already met, or introduce brand new characters. Although I will say I did not see any of the three new Shichibukai coming at all. But yeah, we'll get to that much later. But we see the unintended consequences of the world being thrown off balance as the world becomes a nightmare for the Marines despite their victory, or supposed victory, and you realize just how ineffective they were at their jobs of keeping the peace. And ironically, Whitebeard was actually doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of keeping the peace for a lot of the different islands because of his protection and him annexing them into their territory. And finally, in a moment where the story can kind of slow down and take a breather, we get an update on Luffy, and the thing that stands out to me about this scene the most is just how many people care for and want to help Luffy, and the diversity of these people as well. Like, just take a step back, and you see all the new allies Luffy has accumulated, like a Shichibukai and Pirate Empress Boa Hancock, another Shichibukai and Fishman in Jinbei, a Revolutionary Army leader in Okama in Ivankov, a worst generation supernova Captain like Trafalgar Law, as well as all the folks from Impel Down of the Newcomer Land. And yeah, it never ceases to amaze me the variety of characters that Oda creates and how seamlessly they all work together. Even the characters realize this, as Jinbei and Ivankov talk about how it was almost fate that Luffy brought them all together, that otherwise they would never actually interact with each other. And the final scenes of this episode are rough, seeing Luffy like that, as we see him just jumping back and forth between extreme stages of grief, particularly denial, depression, bargaining, and anger. Like, I do tear up at this moment every time seeing Luffy realizing that what happened to Ace wasn't a dream or a nightmare, that he is really gone. And as sad and as hard as it is to see Luffy like this, I think it's really amazing that even for a shonen manga / anime, it's not afraid to really sit with this and not move on from it really quickly. Like many shows and movies that are geared towards younger audiences, you know, they tend to try and jump past this or just briefly cover it. Luffy doesn't bounce back from this or is even okay at this moment. He is right now suffering from severe trauma and even some form of PTSD, as we see him constantly reliving that moment over and over. And anytime, you know, he lets his mind quiet even for a second, he just sees that vision and just freaks out every time. And to be honest, this is probably the first time in the series where I don't really remember much about how I felt when I first read this moment. I don't know if it was a result of just how hard it was to read it, or so, that I kind of glossed over it, or just kind of brushed past it as quickly as possible, causing it all to kind of blend together. But looking back on this moment and seeing now, it really is a tough thing to see your usually happy-go-lucky, always confident main character reduced to this. And yeah, this is it. We've finally hit the breaking point and the lowest point in this long character story arc for Luffy. If you've been following my podcast for a while, you know that I have often mentioned, ever since we got to Long Ring Longland, that it began a long character arc for Luffy where he will be tested as a person, a pirate, and a captain. And boy, was he tested. Like, when you look at Luffy's character over the course of every arc since they arrived on Long Ring Longland, he has continuously been tested and often experienced some form of failure, especially when it came to his abilities as a captain. It started off with the Davy Back fight, where that was essentially a microcosm of what was about to happen and what he was about to experience down the line, about potentially losing crew members and those he loved due to his inexperience and naivety, as well as sort of his brashness about being a captain. Then literally just after that, he would then go on to have his strength put into question as well, as he gets decimated by Aokiji and almost loses Robin and his own life were it not for Aokiji's whim. This will then, of course, boil over into the infamous falling out with Usopp. And one of the things that always gets tossed into the back seat is the fact that not only was Usopp insecure about his strength and usefulness to the crew, but the reason Luffy himself got uncharacteristically heated was that he was also feeling like his ability as a captain was being put into question. And although we never get to see what Luffy is actually thinking, you can definitely infer that Luffy was also feeling insecure about his captain abilities, which is why he got so pissed off when Usopp started to badmouth Luffy's overall attitude about how he ran the crew. This would then result in him losing his best friend for a little bit. But thank God for Zoro and Sanji being there though. Sanji made sure that Luffy and the other crew members didn't do anything they would regret and took care of sort of the emotional side of things, while Zoro was there to support Luffy in teaching him the tougher parts of what being a leader means. For example, right after his duel with Usopp, he reminds Luffy that this is what it means to be a captain, and you have to have conviction if you are going to lead people who depend on you, no matter how hard the choice is. Of course, there's the other famous scene at the end of the NES Lobby Water 7 arc, when Zoro makes sure that Luffy understands that what they're doing isn't a children's game, and that being a captain means Luffy has a responsibility to uphold a certain standard, or else how are they ever going to survive when they can't truly depend on each other? He makes Luffy understand that Usopp needs to apologize and that Luffy has to grow up. Of course, then Thriller Bark was sort of the inverse of this, where the crew realized they themselves needed to get stronger for Luffy, but Luffy still did experience a defeat here. He just was unaware of it. Thanks in part to Zoro and Sanji, yet again, he was saved though. Luffy, barely making it past Moria, was completely wiped and unable to protect his crew from Kuma. However, Zoro gave up almost everything, even his own dream, to make sure that Luffy survived. And if it were not for the mercy of Kuma, Luffy would have lost one of his nakama that day. And Sanji, for his part, was also willing to give his life. But again, looking at it from the emotional side of things, Sanji made sure to never let Luffy know the truth about that day to protect both Zoro and Luffy's dynamic. Then, of course, we get to the first of his major failures, being completely unable to protect his crew and being dismantled by Kizaru, Sentomaru, and Kuma. Now, at the end of all of this, he was not only unable to save his crew, but now unable to save his brother Ace. Luffy was too weak to save anyone, and not his nakama or his family. And all of this now weighing on him as he's taken loss after loss after loss to the point where it has basically broken him. And I think what Oda has done with Luffy is amazing. Like, he's taken Luffy to his lowest point where he's now lost seemingly everything, basically the midpoint of the character's journey, very reminiscent of Luke Skywalker at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, or pretty much any hero's journey story for that matter. He's now at the darkest point in his journey, which is something you just don't really see very often in shonen series, or if you do, it's incredibly brief. And like I said, as hard as it is to see Luffy like this from a story perspective, it's so engrossing and emotionally charged to read and watch. Like watching a character come face to face with their weakness and experience defeat as a result of it, to see how they respond is why we love the hero's journey so much, and Oda has built up to it so damn well that you really feel for Luffy in this moment and actually care. Like, going forward, it'll be really interesting to see how Luffy bounces back from this devastating series of defeats and build himself back up to face the challenges ahead, especially in the new world. But as we see in these episodes, luckily Luffy is not alone. Like, his network of allies and friends that care about him keeps growing larger and larger, with multiple Shichibukai, supernovas, the Kuja pirates, the new Kamaland people, the remnants of the Whitebeard pirates, and of course his nakama, who aren't here but still care very much for him. And yeah, Luffy will be okay ultimately, but it is very interesting to see. Like, it makes for a really good story seeing Luffy beaten down like this. But yeah, with the Paramount War finally over, Luffy's battle, however, is still not, as he must come to grips with the terrible reality that he failed and has lost his brother Ace. And on the next podcast, we'll get into the history of their brotherly friendship. If you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment, and if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing, please. And check out my Instagram and Twitter account at SunnyGo Podcast for updates of when I post new episodes or to see some pictures of my manga collection. As always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast, and stay tuned for the spoiler section if you're interested in that. If not, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! Alrighty, so spoiler section. I think the first thing I wanted to talk about, and again, these are mostly just unscripted ramblings and not really all that deep or anything, but the first thing I wanted to talk about, and now that we know the full story, or almost the full story, is what Bonnie is talking about when she says it's all his fault. But yeah, as of the most recent Egghead Island, we finally know the full context of what she means here, and she's clearly talking about Dr. Vegapunk and what he's done to Kuma, because we find out that it was literally just days before the war is when Kuma's complete personality was erased and he was turned into that emotionless robot, and that pretty much the entirety of Bonnie's flashback takes place like throughout just all the events during the main One Piece storyline, and so they kind of happen in parallel. And so yeah, it's here that she realizes that something has happened to her father, and that now she's going to go after Vegapunk to have him restore him, or at least get revenge. And now we see, it's crazy. Like, what is this? This happened, I think this was released in 2010 or maybe 2011. And so 13 years later, we finally get to see the fruition of this one quote. And again, the time, it always blows my mind how much time passes, and yet Oda is still able to satisfyingly recall back to a moment in an earlier point in the story. Yeah, I just love it. And Egghead Island is right now one of my favorite arcs in the entire series. And that's not even hyperbole. Like, it's definitely up there. And when it's all said and done, unless it really botches the ending, I can't see this falling any less than like top 3 of my favorite arcs. Even above, this is going to be controversial, but even above this Marineford arc, I think I like Egghead Island more than Marineford arc. Although I guess controversially, I am a little bit more down on Marineford than most people. But I still think Marineford was an excellent arc, one of the best, but Egghead is just so good. The other kind of small detail I kind of wanted to point out, that when Gloriosa, she's reflecting on the fact that how Luffy even survived all this, and that she asks like rhetorically like what God expects from Luffy at this point. And boy, that line has aged really well, because of the fact that Luffy is a god himself. Like, he literally is what made it so that he could survive. Or at least, Nika did. And I don't know, that line, there's not really much to it, I think, but I always just found that line really interesting to watch or read this time, now that we know what Luffy becomes and how he actually survives so many of these crazy things aside from plot armor. But yeah, I found that scene really fun too. But yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. Of course, the Shibukai appointments, the ones that I mentioned that I had no idea was going to happen. Like, I literally didn't know. Well, for one, Weavell, like, he was a brand new character, so of course I couldn't have seen that one coming. But the fact that Buggy and Law became Shibukai were very surprising to me. I had never even considered Buggy being a Shibukai, but the fact that Buggy, not only does he become a Shibukai, then he goes on to become a Yonko. It's just absurd. But it's so fun. I love Buggy in the story at this point. And then Law becoming a Shibukai, that was also really surprising as well. But of course, his Shibukai tenure was incredibly short, just like Blackbeard's was. He was basically using it to get access to Punk Hazard. But yeah. Anyways, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. So thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.